Hello and welcome everyone to our design talk series. I would like to welcome you in today's episode, and our lecture is about the title of becoming a successful designer. Our today speakers are Mariana and David, and I'm delighted to introduce them and give them the space to share with them what they have today about the talk today.
So in advance, thank you guys for having us. Pretty excited to be here. Very interesting time difference. I understand it's a Sunday night, so if you are on here, extra thanks. Sunday night is probably not the night to be watching videos of the two of us, but nevertheless, we're pleased to be here. The talk, which we would hope to be more of a Q&A. So if any of you are watching or listening and you have questions right now or throughout, please feel free to enter them however that's handled, and then we'll answer them as we go. But we figured that what we would talk about is more geared toward younger designers, so maybe even folks who are still students but soon to graduate. And I was actually wondering, I don't know how this is possible, but if it's possible to find out roughly the age of the people who are watching or listening right now, or of the network in general. I don't know if you have an answer to that. Okay, so we're just going to assume that again, the talk we're doing is mostly for younger professionals who are trying to navigate the beginnings of their career and again want to become more successful. And so what we did was we kind of broke down, there's a lot of things we can talk about with this, but we broke down the discussion into 4 or 5 different chapters. The first one being how to become a successful designer regarding the design aspects. And then there's also the financial aspects, basically how to earn more money. How do you get into an office you want to be at? And then once you're in the office, what are things you should or should not do to achieve a level of success in the career? But starting off with the design, maybe Marina can kick it off if you have any big ideas.
Well, I think being a successful designer could be interpreted as David said, in kind of 2 ways. Either it could be being a good designer, good at design, and then being successful, meaning in terms of how much money you're making, right? So how could you become a good, successful designer in terms of design? I think, in the types of offices that you're applying at, it's very important to think about what do they have to offer for you to be better at design. Do you like their design? Are they good at what they're doing? What type of buildings are they working on? And what is their process?
Yeah. I agree. I think one of the mistakes that we see the most often with younger professionals is that everyone wants to go work for the most famous, most well-known architecture office or design office because of the designs they produce, which makes total sense in obvious ways. But I think in those cases, for a lot of younger designers, the quality of the architect's design has more to do with their conceptual alignment with that office and less the technical expertise that office has, and less so whether or not that office is good at teaching that technical information to younger designers. So what I'm saying is that just because an office who's a very big name and they do great, interesting design work that you align with does not necessarily mean it's going to be a great place to go to learn more about architecture or design. They're not necessarily the same things. So what I would say is that in terms of improving your own skill set and knowledge, it's maybe more important to, or one of the things to consider is to go for the offices that are going to offer you information that you don't have. So let's say I'm a designer and I really like doing certain types of designs, and I really like the work of MVRDV. MVRDV is a great office, so I'm just choosing them as an example. And so I go and apply there and I want to work there because I feel like I have design alignment with what they're doing. And that's a good thing for sure. But there's also the flip side of, well, if I go work at an office and their designs are not exactly totally in line with me, but they nevertheless produce really high quality architecture and really high quality buildings, but they're just a little bit different from what I would personally choose. However, they also are really good at teaching their employees or young employees about how to produce buildings, then that actually might be more valuable as a place to work rather than a very design forward office where, let's say on the extreme, the first 2 years, you're not learning anything. You're just cutting blue foam models and you're more or less an intern and a grunt worker.
Well, I think it's kind of like, you know, if you imagine if you're still in school or you're back in school, right? If you had to choose between going to, let's say, a studio that had a certain way to design projects, right? There is an aesthetic that everybody's just doing in that studio, right? And you could imagine that this type of studio is like, let's say, the star architecture firm that, you know, everybody knows, right? They kind of have their signature style. When if you go there, you're going to learn it the way they do it in terms of their aesthetic. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to teach you their process or how to develop your own process in finding your own aesthetic or your own, you know, design skills. So I think if you're trying to be a better designer in terms of design, you should look for offices that are willing to teach you how to get that process and discover that process rather than teach you how to get to that to their outcome, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and I think this touches on probably the most challenging aspect of job applications and what offices to work for is that you really don't know what it's like to work in an office until you get there, unless you have connections to the people within the office to ask them, what is it really like working in this place? Because from the outside, they produce great work. But if I'm there and I'm on the younger side, are they actually going to mentor me in a way that's meaningful? Or again, am I going to be stuck in a closet producing models for the first 18 months because that's how they treat their younger employees? And they're very different things. We've had friends who worked at big name offices, but and they were there for 2 years, fresh out of school. Then we have another friend who works at a much lesser known office, good work, but lesser known, for 2 years. And by the time those 2 years finish, the one at the big office has no skills because they were doing the grunt work, right, for 2 years, and they didn't really learn anything. And the other person who worked for an office that was not well known, in some cases, they learned a lot more, they were better paid, and also they didn't have crazy work hours and they were treated fairly in the office. So, you know, names of offices and the final product don't always communicate what it's like to be at that place.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the way to become a better designer in terms of design is also coming from the work that that office does, but it's also coming from the office culture in that office, right? And oftentimes I feel like, you know, when you're young and out of school, or even when you're a little bit older, you want to kind of work for the big names, because when you talk to people, everybody would know who these people are and their work, right? And there is actually, at least like, you know, what we see where we are, there is a lot of very good local, smaller architecture firm that maybe don't get the press or the prestige of the big one, but who are very dedicated to what they do, and they have a great office culture. They have super strong missions and values within the work that they do, but also as an office and the way they treat their people.
Yeah.
And I think that's as important, if not more important, than the outcome of the project that they work on. You know, and I think you can learn a lot with the peers and the colleagues that you have in those offices. So really finding how, you know, the office is as a place to work is very important. And it could be as simple as, you know, you're still in school and you're thinking of applying to these places. Well, reach out to maybe a few people who work there and see if you can have coffee with them, or give them a call, or ask them, you know, a few questions just to kind of like understand how the office is structured. What is the culture? What is the things that they do within the office that maybe other offices don't do? Because I think those are very important.
And it's not to say that working for big offices or successful
Yeah.
architects is not a good route. There are plenty of successful offices that are really, really good in all aspects. But it's just, I think, a common misconception that students have, and younger designers, because the amount of knowledge you need to acquire to be a good architect, and in our case, there's a lot of things. There's the conceptual aspect of design, the more theoretical aspects. There's the technical aspects of how do you draw and design an actual building that's going to be built. There's an understanding with that of structures, of codes. There's an understanding of project management and working in a team. And then there's the client interfacing, how to work with the client. And so of those 4-ish things that I mentioned, the concept level of design, which is what most young designers are good at, is only a quarter of it, maybe even less, frankly, in a lot of ways. So I would really think about, like, what are the things that I'm missing as a young designer, and let me go after that stuff. And it's uncomfortable because you're putting yourself in a position where you have no idea, you don't know these things. And I think that I also find that in terms of improving oneself, the mistake that people make is that it's very easy to just keep doing what you know and be good at that. So even a more specific example is it more common for an architecture office to hire a younger professional for their, let's say, rendering skills, as being even more specific. And that younger designer is perfectly fine doing that because they can provide an expertise to that office. They're good at it. So that's what they do. And they keep doing that for a month, 2 months, 3 months, a year, et cetera, et cetera. But again, if you think about the growth that takes place within that 2 years, a person who sticks to what they know, they're not going to be nearly as good of an architect, frankly, at the end of the 2 years, versus someone who put themselves in a position where they know nothing about what they're trying to do, and they have to rely on the office to teach them.
And it's pretty risky, and it's pretty uncomfortable to do things that you don't know. And maybe you get into one of these places because you have that, let's say, rendering skill, right? But I think you have to remember, like, what is the end goal here? What is the next step? Like, are you just plenty content with doing that for the rest of your lives? Are you looking to do more? And therefore, what is the next thing you would need to do to get the next skill set, in your toolbox, in order to just keep moving up as a designer, as an architect?
The next topic is once you're in an office, we get a lot of questions through our podcast about what can I do once I'm in an office to ensure that I am learning as much as I need to learn, and I'm having a successful time in that place. And for me, there's just a few tips, and they're pretty straightforward, but they're really important. The first one is basically to not be quiet, which is to say that if you have questions about something, then you have to ask. I think too many younger professionals are hesitant to ask questions because, again, they're afraid of sounding stupid, which is a fear that we all have, frankly. But if you don't ask questions, you're not going to learn. And actually, to be honest, from an employer's perspective and a project manager's perspective, it's a pretty major red flag if you bring on a new employee or even an intern and they're not asking any questions, because that's ridiculous. If you have less than 5 years of experience, you must have thousands of questions, every year. And so if you're not asking, it means either that it means you're afraid, and that's not the way to go about it. And employers are, if it's a good employer, they're more interested in seeing you grow and learn so that you can be helpful to them, rather than having you sit and be quiet and then not know, because that's less of an advantage for the employer. So this fear of, like, you're going to sound ignorant and the employer is going to be upset with you, or the project manager is going to think like, oh, why don't they know this? No, they want to keep giving you knowledge, because the more they give you, the more you can give back to them.
I mean, there is a limit to that, right? Like, you can't be asking questions, all the time about everything. Like, you also on your own have to be proactive in wanting to learn those things, or finding the information yourself. But I think just showing that you're invested in the office and in the work that they do, and you basically want to be part of it and bring value and help them grow and do better work, I think it's invaluable to any firms, because that's the type of employee that anyone would want to have, right? Someone who's wanting to do better and be better. So that's super important.
Yeah, like taking initiative in a way. And
Yeah.
also it's, it's about finding mentors, whether they are labeled officially as a mentor or they just kind of naturally fill that position. It's about finding people who are willing to help you. And at least within the architecture community, most architects who are older are pretty cool and willing to help out a younger person. So if you approach them, and even if they're not on your team, there's someone else in the office or someone else is not even in the office, and you say, hey, I have questions about this, can we grab coffee sometime? And I ask you a bunch of questions. There's like a 99% chance they're going to say yes.
Another thing I think people kind of underestimate is the importance of like yearly review. And I don't know where you guys are at, how things are being handled, but here in the US, usually at the end of each year, each employee gets a review with one of the design principals or partners of an office. And I think it's kind of, it's a critical time to be able to voice the things that maybe you will want to be interested in doing in the office that you don't really get a chance to talk about on a day-to-day basis because everybody's busy just doing the work, right? But I think if you're like, well, I've been doing like mostly conceptual sketches and phases on those projects, but I'm very interested in just going on site, seeing constructions, being involved during the construction phases and administration, you have to voice that out because the people who usually run offices, they're preoccupied with business things, right? They don't really see on a day-to-day basis, like what, the employees might be interested in doing or keeping tabs on those things. So you either have to remind them or you have to just put in the forefront of their mind. And that also helps them, thinking of, well, we need to move people around. We need to rearrange the team. Well, this person wants to become a leader in one of those projects, or they want to take on a bigger role on this project. Let's give them a chance, right? So I think, no matter what age you are, if you're older, if you're younger, not being afraid to ask for the things that you want. And it could be for a raise, or it could be for changing project. It could be for being involved in a phase that you've never worked on before. But you are your only advocate. So if you don't ask for the things that you want, you can't expect people to give it to you.
And then lastly, tied with that is, I think all of what was just said is rooted in the idea of being honest with yourself. So I generally find that younger professionals are actually really smart. And I think they underestimate how intelligent they are sometimes. Meaning to say that they will find themselves in a situation, let's say in an office, and they feel like, well, what's taking place doesn't really make sense. There's a better way to do it. But they don't say anything because they think, well, I'm only 28 or 25 or whatever. And this person who's running the thing is 45 or 50. They must know what they're doing. So I'm not going to say anything, even though it just doesn't make sense to me. That is the wrong mentality to have. If you see something and you feel like it's not right and it could be done better, either on the extreme end of like the hours are too long and there's borderline employee abuse, or on the lesser side of like, why don't we structure this thing in a way so we're more efficient? In either of those cases, you should say something, because it is most of the time I found that those younger professionals are actually correct. And the thing is, those incorrect working behaviors, which are inefficient or don't make sense or are not right, have continued because no one's ever said anything. And again, it goes back sort of to what Marina was alluding to. If your employer is a good employer, they're going to be like, hey, that's a great idea. Thanks for bringing that to our attention. Even though you're 25 and you just started, that no one said that before. Let's try it out, right? Or thanks for bringing attention. You know what? I totally get what you're saying. I really appreciate that you're being outspoken. In this case, I think this is better, but please keep giving us feedback. So again, it starts with being honest with yourself, and then after that, being not afraid to speak up.
And I think that kind of leads to the next point, which is burnout, right? If you don't voice those things and you feel like, well, you're kind of, you're not saying what you're thinking, but you just keep dealing with a situation you don't agree with, you're going to end up in a position where you're not happy. Yeah. And at some point, just things starts to accumulate and you're not happy and you're just there not happy. And you become one of those, grumpy, frustrated architects. And we don't need more of these types of
We have too many of them already.
You have too many, and that's doing a huge detriment to that person itself, but also to the work that's being produced through that person, to the profession, and so on. It's just like a domino effect, right? So I think voicing your concern, and if the firm you're at does not hear you, then that just means it's time to move on to the next one. There is a million offices that do architecture work better and in different ways. And it's very hard, honestly, to find the right fit. Like we've each worked at, I don't know, over half a dozen firms, and it takes time to find a place where you feel like you get most of the things that you're looking for. You know, it's like dating or finding the right person to spend the rest of your life with. It's not an easy thing, and you can't force it.
No.
You know, you shouldn't stay at an office for 30 years if it's not working out, because it's not good for anybody. So I think being honest with yourself also means that if it's not working, you have to be honest and assess that it's not working, and then take action and, you know, look for something else.
Yeah, you got to be fearless. So I'll give a couple stories. I was at an office, and the office was a great place for many reasons, but I didn't feel like I was getting paid enough. And in hindsight, I wasn't, not even close. But at the time, I didn't feel like I was being paid enough. So I said, look, you got to pay me more money. I said it a more eloquent way than that, but now the raise is coming up. I need this amount because it's just too difficult to survive without it. And they gave me part of it, but it wasn't what I needed, frankly. So, and there were other aspects of the office I wasn't happy with. So I quit. I quit. And it was really difficult because I really loved that office, and the employees there were just outside of like a few, but everyone there they were like family, and it was one of the best experiences I've had as far as working at an office. But it was a great change, and I went on to another office, ended up making a lot more money. And then here's a twist. That second office started off great. It ended up being a horrible place to work at. Horrible. And after I was there for a period of time, I thought this was a huge mistake. Why did I leave that other office for this new one? I'm now making enough money where I'm not financially, you know, concerned every month, but this is not worth it. And so the problem with that second office had to do with the team I was on, I felt. So I went to the senior person. I said, hey, I like being here. The projects are great. The work is good. This team's not fitting with me. I'm not here to to cause problems with anyone, but I'm just asking that for the next project, can I be on a different team? I'll stay on this team right now. I know as far as everyone else in the team knows, like I'm happy, but inside I'm not. So I want to be on a different team the next time. Then I was fired. I was like, oh my God. So I went from quitting a job, making more money, and then getting fired. And, you know, if anyone's been fired before, it's like a horrible feeling. And it ended up being that the next office I worked at was the one office I had always wanted to work at in that particular city. And the pay was even higher than it was in the second office. And I was doing better projects, and I was in a great team. It's not to say that every story ends in a happy ending, but what it means is that at each of those marks, huge risks were taken on my part. I didn't have a lot of money saved up in the bank. If I lost a job and I went months without money, it was a huge problem. But huge risks were taken, and it paid off. And it is also a lesson that I think you need to be fearless. I think a lot of employees in particular are afraid of basically getting fired, which I understand. But when you change and you leave an office, either by your own will or it's forced upon you, most of the time, for most people, like 95% of them, that change is a good thing, even if you don't want it. Meaning to say that you get fired and you don't want to be fired. But for most people, they're actually not quite happy at their job. And when you get axed and you move on to somewhere else and you find a better position, it ends up being for the better. And I've heard that kind of story countless times from listeners and fellow architects, where something happens and they freak out because there's a forced change. They were fired, and they're like, hey, I'm at a better place now. I never realized before that I was really unhappy because of X, Y, and Z things. And I lied to myself saying I was content because I was afraid of leaving.
Yeah, and that kind of leads also to the next topic, which is how to be more successful in making more money.
I think to that matter, just before we move on with the burnout, because I start to have one question also here from one of the topics. So I think he owns an office, and the question is as it goes: how to evolve my architectural office, but also find a balance with other roles, I assume, professor, NGO, postmaster. I think he has a lot of roles, but that was the questions.
Because you repeat the question one more time.
How to evolve my architecture office, but also find a balance with other roles, I assume, as professor, NGO, or postmaster, I think.
So how do we evolve the office while being a teacher? Is that the question?
I think he plays more than one role, but again, he thinks to how to balance between the office and other roles related to that matter.
Other roles outside of the office. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think he is managing because it seems like he is an office. He holds an office, and there is other aspects like he's managing NGO or he is teaching like part time. It's
I see.
also related to his domain. Yeah.
I see. Did you have something?
Well, you're probably more versed in that.
Yeah. So I'll understand the premise of the question is that someone has an office, but they also have other things they're responsible for, and how do you manage all of that while having the office grow? It's a good question. It's one that we find ourselves in. So we have an office, we have a podcast, and I used to teach architecture off and on for about 6 or 7 years. So assuming this person is in the similar situation, that's it. That's the, I don't know if you have the answer, let me know, because I'm trying to figure it out. One thing I'll say, and this might not be what the person wants to hear, but it's some advice I received from a former professor of mine, which has always stuck with me. This guy, I had him as a teacher in school, super smart, very intelligent. The same thing as with many professors, he was a teacher, but also had his own office. Years later, we catch up for coffee, and I wanted to talk with him just to catch up and for advice, because I was also about to start my own office and I was teaching. And I had that question, like, how do you do both? Because it's very common for architects to teach part-time as a way to make some stable income to then support their ability to do their office. And also they love teaching. And his advice was, you need to choose. You need to choose. Either you're going to be a full-time professor and then you're an academic and that's what you do, or you're a full-time practitioner. You can't do both equally well. And it really stuck with me because he said, honestly, I've been doing both the last 15 years. I haven't gotten anywhere in either of them because I'm not dedicated to either or. Are there people who are successful architects who teach? Yes. Most of the time, though, those architects, they achieve their success after many, many, many decades, which I have no intention of waiting that long. Or they're a really well-known established architect and they have TAs who run, teachers assistants who run the studios, the classes, or they're so established that they have a whole bunch of people in their office that can run the office for them and they can afford to leave for 6 hours a week to teach a class. But if you're in a position like us, who are on the front side of the hill, you kind of have to choose. So for me, I stopped teaching 2 years ago. Program wanted me back. They wanted me to do more responsibilities. I said, no, I can't. It's taking too much time. I can't do it. So unfortunately, I personally feel, and I agree with my, I guess you call him a mentor or former teacher, that when it comes to teaching and practice, you have to choose one or the other because it's just too difficult to do both equally well. And I think running a practice is really hard.
I think it's hard to start both of these tracks concurrently and have them being successful at the same time. And, maybe it's like if you're trying to fast track a project, but you're starting everything at the same time, you might need to kind of like stagger the two just in order for one to start running a little bit further ahead than the other one. It's like, we have phases in projects, but it's kind of like the same thing. I think kind of thinking about your career and your life as an architect as a project and how you can strategize to make it work is super important. And we're used to think that way, right? So maybe you're just focusing on your office for the first 3 or 4 years, and then you get into teaching slowly, but at least you're ahead in one of the two. I think it's very hard to just kind of like put them on equal levels from the beginning and just hope that they're each going to evolve, simultaneously and equally. I think it just brings a lot of frustration. It's very hard because, as you know, when you're starting things, you invest yourself into those things very much. And if you have two sides pulling you apart, there's going to be, consequences and sacrifices. And I don't think it's necessarily the smartest way.
I mean, our experience is obviously mostly in the United States and the Marina and France. So we only know it from our exposure to things, but the number of professors I know who have their own practice, who when their practice is not successful at all, and it sounds harsh, but it's true, and their practice barely even exists, that's every teacher I've ever known. Everyone has I have an office. No, you don't, not really. I will say also that we do have a podcast, obviously, and the podcast is like this platform and it's grown to a certain level. And so, but we do manage that on top of the office very well. And it's a similar thing. So with what Marina was saying, you know, the podcast was started several years before our office. So it allowed us to kind of get that up and running before the office itself. That's not to say we haven't had challenges, of course not, because we're always being pulled between these two things, and the show is always taking up more time as it grows, and et cetera, et cetera. And one of the keys, I think, to success with managing multiple things is creating systems. This is not new information, but it's nonetheless helpful. Is you figure out a system and a structure so that things can operate more on its own autonomously from you, and then you play more of the role of manager. So in the case of the podcast, that's what happened for us. We set up a system. We have a person in place that helps us, and so I have to dedicate less and less time to that and give more responsibility to other people.
I think this systems organization, and also if one of the two things or three things that you're trying to start, again, is a little bit ahead of the other two, then at some point you can bring more people on board to help you bring it further, right? So if you're trying to tackle, you know, two or three things at the same time, at some point you're going to need help. But you don't want to bring on help if you don't really know what you're doing yet, because it's pointless. So you know, it comes back to planning, strategizing, being organized, you know, phasing things in different timeline and sequencing.
I think also as a business owner, and it's sometimes difficult to delegate to other folks because you want control over the product, whether it be the building or a show or whatever else. But you also, you know, it's money out of your pocket. And then you're bringing in money, but that money just goes to paying people to do stuff. And you feel like, well, if I do it myself, I could keep that money. And that's just the wrong mentality, because it's you have to do that to scale. And you know, in our case, when we've had to make that transition, of course we were hesitant. And I was hesitant. I'm like, well, if I do the work myself, then I can keep the money, and that's cool. But do I have any regrets about paying someone to help us with the work? No, absolutely not. Best decision ever, because your time is more valuable than you probably think. So without knowing the person who asked the question, that hopefully that was somewhat helpful for you. The other subject we want to touch on, we were talking about working in offices and changing offices, is basically how to make more money, primarily as an employee. And if someone's listening and you're an employer and you have a question about that, then please ask. But as an employee, as a younger designer, how do I make more money and make sure I'm not being underpaid?
Are you asking me the question? Okay, great. What I was saying that, you know, moving around is of course one way to make more money. Asking for raises is one way, but that requires maybe sometimes spending more time at an office to get to the next level. You know, when you're younger, moving around, every time you apply for a new job, you negotiate a salary. So I think it's also an opportunity to just, you know, get to the next category up.
That's really the best way.
It's as a younger professional, it's the best way. Once you're a little bit later in your career, I think it might be a bit more difficult, but also why not? That's why also I think if you apply to big offices that are known to, you know, hire a lot of younger architects, they're probably not going to pay you as well.
Sometimes this is true, yeah.
If you try to apply to these big name offices later on in your career, you're probably better off then, because they will most likely have a higher position to offer you, and those positions, you know, I think will come up with higher salaries.
Yeah, I know there's an asterisk next to all this information, which is it varies case by case greatly, always. But there are, as Marina said, there are definitely large offices, and their business model is to underpay huge amounts of younger employees. And that's their business model, and you don't want to be part of that. But it is true that jumping from office to office is the best way and the quickest way to make more money, like significantly It's not going to be a lot of money, but significantly percentage-wise, significant jumps from 1 year to the next. We've had friends who stuck around in one office and for a long time, and they make whatever small percentage increase raise per year, and they start off at a low number, right? And they make a tiny percentage increase, and after like 5 or 10 years, they're barely making anything. And in other situations, we've seen other people who were frankly less talented sometimes. And they worked at one office for 2 years, another office for 2 years, another office for 2 years. And each time they make quantum leaps in how much money they're being paid and their responsibility. And again, if you track the time over the course of 8 years, you have the 8-year person who made one office, tiny increments of raises, and the other person who like jump. And you look over, you're like, how did that person end up being senior out of whatever title at big name office, and they're getting paid a whole bunch of money? That person's not nearly as talented as this other person. And it's because they probably grew into the positions and became smarter, but also because they played the game correctly, right? There is a limit to how quickly you want to jump, though. There's no set rules, but you should, I think, be in an office for at least 2 years is a good mark, because any less than that, you're not really involved in the office enough to know it. Well,
then projects take forever. So if you're only there for like a year or less, you're most likely not going to see anything through, unless maybe you do interior work, then you might.
And even then, realistically, 2 years is not enough time to see through a whole project. But there's something about that number generally where when an employer sees on paper that this younger professional was at this office for 2 years, I feel more comfortable about it compared to seeing, again, 12 months, even though I know 2 years is not long enough to like see through even a complex house. But somehow it feels more legitimate.
There is also people who just stay at the same office forever, and eventually they get promoted to the next level because people just keep leaving. So
yeah, that's true.
They get promoted by default. I mean, I think you could definitely take the kind of like the back seat and just wait and see what happens. It might take a while, and the chances might be a little bit smaller than if you're moving around. I also think that moving around when you're younger is good because you're going to capture a little bit of different experience, different ways to do things, see how each of these firms operates and do what they do. And there is not just one way to do what we do. So I think it's pretty important.
Yeah.
I mean,
I'm a huge fan. Oh, someone's
yeah, this is sorry for interrupting me. Just like
no.
Another thing I came up with, freelancing, and I think it's a little bit trend and also contributes to what you have been discussed, because there is this question about someone. I think he's a freelancer and he says it's a good income and allowed me to learn more somehow, but I'm still confused. Should I go to be an employee or keep joining? Should I keep looking for jobs?
Oh, that's a good question.
That's a good question. What's nice, I've freelanced a little bit between things, and it is great, especially if you're more of an independent type of personality, because you're in charge of your own schedule, you're in charge of your own project, you manage things the way you want. In terms of money, you have more control on how much you can charge your client, which is your, the employer or the architecture firm you work for. There is things that are detrimental in doing that. You don't get employee benefits. You don't have any coworkers. You don't have any office culture. You're just kind of on your own. So, in the long term, I think I'm not sure it's the right thing to do unless that's your thing. And if it's your thing, then maybe the next thing is just having your own practice, and not being an employee.
It's really difficult, though. It's a great question, and frankly, it's one that we've not come across, which is rare. But the challenge, which I think was embedded in the question, is how do you gain more knowledge, though, if you're freelancing? Because you're by yourself. You don't necessarily have, a senior partner next to you to ask questions. Again, Marina's more the expert in this area.
Well, there is books, but books don't talk, so it's not great. if you really want to just stay a freelancer, then I think you have somehow to find your local architecture community of freelancers, entrepreneurs, people who have their own business, people who would like to be your mentor, but basically resources that come from other people, like as you know, their experience.
I agree with that. Actually, that's a great point.
You know, and I think it's something that it feels to us doing the podcast that the architecture community is becoming stronger and stronger in the sense of being a community and supporting each other and opening dialogue and sharing information and being resources for each other. So I think you could definitely be a freelancer, but I think you should tap into your community and feel like you're not alone in it.
Yeah, there's a phrase for those kinds of groups. They're typically called mastermind groups, I believe. And basically it's just a term for when you have a group of people who are like-minded, usually in the same industry or same professions or same expertise, and they just share information completely openly without ego, without concern of giving away their secrets. And they're usually private groups if they're online, or if they're in person, then obviously they're private because they're just in person. And this is very common. I don't know if like architects are typically aware of this, but for the entrepreneurial space and business owners, this is super common. For CFOs and CEOs, there are groups dedicated to just CEOs, to just CFOs, and they get together and they share info and say, how do you do this? Like, I had this problem with whatever. How did you solve it specifically? Okay, I'll tell you step by step. This is how we solved it based on this situation, based on our, business size and et cetera. So I agree with Marina. I think it might be difficult to do, but if you can find or form a group like that, it's huge. It's unfortunate that once we get out into the profession, sometimes we feel even more siloed. The other thing I was going to say with it is that you could go work for an office and just work for an office for a couple of years and then leave and then go back to freelancing if you feel like that's a way to increase your skill set.
I actually had a coworker who was hired as a freelancer. So he would be in the office, show up in the office, but his contract was a freelancer. So he was totally free of his time and the way he was running his things, which is kind of unusual. And after so many years being a freelancer, I always wonder, like, why don't you just be an employee? You have, all of the employee benefits and all of that. But for him, it was important to have his freedom and his independence. So, it could also be maybe something you negotiate with an office or two that you're currently working with, that you're their in-house freelancer and maybe you show up in their firm and work there 2 days a week and the other 2 you're somewhere else. If you kind of like the variety of projects and firms you're working with at the moment. Because I can understand that some people don't necessarily want to be in one office 7 days a week, right? You kind of want to experience different things and work on different types of projects and see different people. So if they're receptive, there might be a way to make something work that's a little bit unusual.
I think it depends on the personality of the individual asking the question. They're probably thinking, yeah, I really don't want to work in an office. So then go find some freelancers who are at the similar level or a little bit higher and see if you can form a group. I mean, I really do think
a freelancing business, where it's not just you, like,
well, yeah, then it's an office. But I do think there's a lot of architects out there who feel, again, siloed and they feel like they're alone. And it's not the case. And I think the more in general, as a profession and as a community, we can start to bring everyone together, just one-on-one, 1-on-3, 1-on-4. It makes a huge difference. It's just, there's no need to struggle on your own. So how much time do we have left?
I think we have 15 minutes. Usually by this time we try to take more questions, but since we are doing this kind of a dialogue, so we can move on with the same topics you are bringing.
Okay. Okay, so about 50. So if anyone does have questions, now's the time to ask. Yes. For yes. Sure. And whilst you guys are thinking and entering them, we'll kind of just keep vamping and talking. Looking at my notes here. Oh, so one of the questions that we also get often is, how do I get into an office that I really want to work at? And I know it's a great office and I want to get in there. How do I do that?
My answer is you just have to keep applying there. constantly.
Yeah, there's
it's all about timing. It's all about timing and kind of things aligning, right? Those offices of, they have phases where they hire, or they have more projects coming in, they need to bring on more people, or someone decided to leave. You can't really predict when they're going to be hiring. So I think we can speak from experience. The last offices we worked at were probably the offices we wanted to be working at. And I think I applied to that office at least 3 times over the course of like 5 years, and I got in at some point. And I'm not sure what happened. If it was my resume was different, I had more experience. If they were looking for someone that had more of my profile than before, but it worked out. But it took 3 chances.
Yeah, I second that. 98% of it is just timing, to be honest. I mean, you do need to have a decent portfolio and all that kind of stuff, but it really comes down to timing. I think the other way to make yourself more appealing, like recently I was asked, like, is it better to start by working at a smaller office that's lesser known, or work at a bigger office that's more well known, or an office that is one project type versus another type, et cetera, et cetera. And there's no hard permanent rules to any of this, but I will say that it very much seems to be that if on your resume you've worked at a very well-known office, again, for at least 2 years, it's much easier than to go work somewhere else. That might sound obvious, but it does carry some weight. And the reason why is that a lot of times for smaller offices, they don't necessarily know what goes on in the big name offices. And because of that, those places, the big name offices, always have a kind of sense of mystery and like expertise that they have that, as a smaller office, I don't know about. And it makes people who are applying to the small offices much more appealing, honestly, because they've been at that big place. It's like, oh, wow, they worked at, I don't know, SOM or something. Wow, they must be amazing. And then of course, they get hired and they start, and you're like, yeah, this is just another guy. He's not any different than everyone else in our office. But there's some kind of this thing where we think that there's some expertise. So if you have the opportunity to work at a larger name office, I think that does help you make you more appealing to a wider variety of places. Beyond that, I do think it's timing, it's portfolio, and obviously, it kind of goes without saying, but having someone within the office that can be of help for getting you in is a big deal. And it doesn't have to be like your best friend. It doesn't have to be of a friend of a friend. It could be that you just happen to have the same hobby that you found out on LinkedIn, or you went to the same school, or the connection between you and the individual in that place you want to work at can be the thinnest thread you could possibly imagine. And that's all you need to start a conversation. Because again, most architects are willing to help out other architects. And if someone reaches out to them and says, hey, this is kind of random, you don't know me, but I really want to work at your place, or whatever. Can you tell me more about that office? Would you be willing to have a chat with me via Zoom, or let's get a coffee? Again, they're going to say yes most of the time. Right?
Actually, yeah. Great. Also, I have a question here. I would like to give it for any of you guys. Okay, we have two. I will give you the first one. What kind of a design process do you use when you communicate with other stakeholders in the same project? Is it an iterative design process, or you feel more like you are the leader of the team? I can repeat.
I'm actually reading the question.
Yeah, okay.
I'm curious to know what they mean by stakeholders, because that could be different things. Let me think. Let's see.
Yeah, it's stakeholder. Like,
okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay.
I'm assuming stakeholder means like other people, professionals in the project.
Yes.
That's what I'm guessing too.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah. I prefer it to be iterative. I think the architect is yes. The architect is the one who's kind of leading the design and the whole mission, so to speak. But so at the end of the day, it's the architect who's leading, but I think it's a matter of how you lead. And I think it's better if you allow people the space and the time and the comfort zone to feel like that they are equally invested and equally important in the project, which they are in many ways. I don't know if Rudy have thoughts on that, but that's my thought. Like the people you're working with, they need to feel like they have a voice and they're important. It's a really a human connection aspect of working with other people.
But I think most often when there is, let's say, a landscape architect, a structural engineer, or whoever else is working on the project, the architect is kind of that point person that will lead the team or make sure everybody is kind of on the same track and the same direction. But I think we're kind of past the years where the architect was kind of forcing their vision on everyone else in the team. Like that's not how things are working anymore. And I don't think that's how they should be working anyway. So making it a collaborative process, if it's iterative within every professional's industry, if it's iterative as a group, but I think like you mentioned, just making sure that everybody feels like they have a voice on the project and that they can participate and share and being heard is super important.
The thing is, it's important for many reasons. I mean, it's important for the quality of the building. It's important for that human relationship when you're working with somebody. And also, as we all know, like when you're designing and building a building, like shit's going to hit the fan, something's going to go wrong. And there's going to be really stressful situations at least a couple times in the process. And so if you establish a relationship with your fellow professionals where they feel like they have a say and they're important, when that bad time happens, they're going to have your back. They're going to say like, okay, you know, I feel invested in this project. The architect's not being, as Marina described, the one that's just cracking the whip. Okay, let's work together and solve this. When that mentality is not there, why would they go that extra mile to help if you're just telling them what to do all the time?
And it's hard, I think, because you don't always get to choose who those other stakeholders on the projects are. You know, sometimes the architects comes with, well, their own landscape architect that they selected, and you're not sure like it's gonna work out the way you want it to work out because of personality alignment and why not. But just showing your best and giving your best and, you know, just being as professional and cordial as possible would usually mirror on the other side, right? Like if you show them that you're interested in what they do, that all you want is, you know, for the project to work out and everybody to be happy, I don't think you would get much pushback on the other side. And if you do, well, you do what you can. And if it doesn't work, then maybe you have to report to the client or maybe something else has to change.
There's another question we want to get to, but the last thing I'll say with the first question, talking more about the design process, is that we like to get everyone involved as early as possible. So the structural engineer, right? The structural engineer, we in a lot of cases, we don't really need them to be heavily involved from the very beginning. Varies on the project, of course. But, you know, we can kick off concept design generally without an engineer because we know roughly what's going to take place. But even then, I do find it's a good, call it strategy or way of working in the design process to at least have the phone call with them and introduce yourselves if you don't know them and just like start. So just because you're involving another professional in the design process earlier than you typically would does not mean that they're going to have heavy say at that early phases. It just means you're allowing them to be part of it. And it really goes a long way for that person to feel like, okay, they care about what I have to say enough so where they're just even having a 15-minute phone call with me just to talk generally about structures or see how my life is going and that kind of stuff. And you might say, well, it's not really related to design process, but I kind of think it is because it just smooths things over so that when you do have the heavy lifting portion of their contribution in the design process, you already have a relationship. So yeah, it is more iterative in that you're all working together, but it doesn't necessarily mean that, again, you're relying on them heavily from day zero. The second question.
Yes. I think it's about asking about the gap years within the profession and practice, how to best remedy that, especially if you want to continue within the profession or apply to grad school.
This is a tricky one. We haven't had gap years yet, although we never know. We might go back to work for an office at some point in our lives, and then that's that. Well, I mean, depending on the reason of the gap years, maybe you can make the most of it, right? Let's say you you had a big burnout and you had to take a full year off to kind of recover from that burnout. Well, you know, what do you put? Do you just skip that date on the resume and hope nobody asks during the interview? Do you actually mention why you decided to take that gap and what happened during that year? I don't know.
Yeah, gap years. If you're doing it for grad school, I wouldn't be concerned because everyone else is going to have a gap year.
You know, we had friends who took a gap year to prepare to apply for grad school, and you know, they took the year off completely and kind of traveled the world and did small jobs in different countries while they were kind of writing their application for grad school. So I'm sure in that case, those friends were able to kind of use that human experience of the gap year to their advantage. If you had a gap year because it was COVID and you know you decided not to work or not to go to school, then I don't know, you probably have learned something in that gap year that you could kind of use and expand on in some ways.
Yeah, the gap year is an interesting question. To be honest, it's not something I always felt was a concern because if we're talking about 5 years, then that's different. But if we're talking about 1 or 2 years, especially if those 1 or 2 years are spent doing grad school, architecture school, then, I mean, honestly, it's not really a disadvantage because everyone else is doing the same exact thing. And it's just part of it. I think it also comes into play the long-term vision. 1 year dedicated to grad school, 2 years is nothing in the longer term of practicing for 10, 15, 20 years. It's not going to make a difference. So I maybe this is a non-answer, but I just wouldn't be concerned. It's fine. It's fine. And yeah, I think it's fine. The first question person asked a follow-up question, or they mentioned.
Yeah, he's mentioning, I think as I can see that he have some contributing the same idea about the type of project that should be more focused on technical or aspects. So maybe David and Mariana, it's about to finish. Our session is about to end, but last question maybe can go with from your point of view, what is how we can describe success in our career as designers from your point of view?
Yeah, I'll start with this one. I think historically architects have prioritized the quality of the design and the innovation of the design of buildings as being the only thing that defines success. And it's a huge part of success, but it's not the only thing. I think the profession in general has done itself a giant disservice by focusing pretty almost solely on that as success. But success by any standards in today's world also means you have a thriving, sustainable business where you are making good money for yourself and for your employees. And it's not necessarily something we talked about a whole lot. It's more from an employer's perspective, but success has to be achieved there. If it's not, then this profession then the office and the profession is unsustainable. It's kind of depressing.
It's kind of a downy, but yeah, I mean, I think success I think nowadays is defined by you know, financial success. And I think for architects to be successful architects, we just have to be better at business. And that's something we haven't talked about really, but I think architects are known not to be good at selling their services or being paid for their services in the way that makes sense. You know, if you look at any doctors or attorney, they are successful because they know how to charge their clients. They know how to get paid. They know how, then they make sure that the world knows that their time is valuable and therefore, you know, they should get paid.
And this same observation is certainly something the younger professionals have to think about as well, even though you're employees. So I think employees, their responsibility is to be successful in making sure they are not underpaid and taken advantage of. And also, mainly what we said throughout the conversation is acquiring knowledge.
It starts from the younger, most bottom level of the profession, which is even, you know, internship or like your first job as an architect. I would scream on every roof: do not take positions that don't pay. Do not take free jobs that give you just a stipend a month. Do not take pay that are below the minimum wage. You know, I understand everybody's financials are different, but in, you know, making sure that at some point you're going to be successful and your profession is going to be successful as a whole, you have to participate and make sure those things don't happen anymore.
This was very enlightful. I would like to thank you. This should be the end of our session for today. I would like to thank you for this insightful dialogue and this ideas and concepts you have explained here today. And also, I would like to thank our attendees for showing up today. And thank you guys, David and Mariana.
Thank you.
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you so much for having us. Have a good evening.
Great. Thank you.
Thank
Later.
you. Bye-bye.